are recording, so if you want to go, yeah, yay, we'll give her a round of applause as she's starting and as she ends up. Okay.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Can everybody hear me?
You bet.
Okay, awesome. So I'm really excited to talk to you. I love talking about podcasting because it's totally changed my life. And I'm hoping that if you're interested in getting started, that I can inspire you to get started just like I did. However, I have to admit that when I decided to go for it, I wish I knew the information that I'm going to share with you today, because oftentimes when you go and look to start a podcast, you're always looking to, what type of equipment do I need? What are all the logistics that are involved? And I'm going to share all that with you. But I think it's very important to start with your why and also understand the audience and why people are going to spend part of their lives listening to you and your guests, or if you're going solo. So I want to start the presentation first off by talking about some of the top reasons why people listen to podcasts, because I think that's very, very helpful in terms of how you want to approach the audience that you're going to go after when you do start a podcast. And by the way, if you have any questions along the way, feel free to ask me. But if you want to wait till the end, I'll try to get through it so that I can address any of those questions. We talked about guesting on shows. I'm happy to give you a few tips there as well. So I'll start by sharing the list that I put together here for you. So here are some of the reasons why people listen to podcasts. Well, one of the reasons I started the podcast to help people get unstuck. They don't take action because they're afraid, or they don't have enough information and they don't have the time to research. And so they go to podcasts to get information so that they can get inspired to move forward, which is the second one. It's inspiration, right? The third one is to maximize their time. Podcasting is really unique because you can do a million things while you're podcasting. You could be driving, you could be cleaning the house, you could be walking in the neighborhood. So it really helps you kind of keep your mind stimulated and learn things while you're doing other things, which is fantastic. Assuming you're not doing video, by the way. I don't do video, but that's an option. So you can definitely, repurpose your podcast. And then it's also to learn. That's pretty obvious. We all want to learn new information. Stay informed. So maybe you want to know about news or any other specific information out there that you want to stay updated on to improve yourself. Self-improvement is a big reason. To strengthen your relationships. Maybe you want to listen to a podcast about relationships, so that might help. To move forward, again, it's about taking action. Those are words that I use a lot in my podcast. To get motivated, and then to be entertained. Some podcasts, let's be honest, are just about, silly things you just that are going to make you laugh or be entertained. And so, these are just some of the reasons why. And I think maybe some of those things might resonate with you if you're planning to start a podcast, but I think it's important to be aware of that. So now I'm going to jump right into the play-by-play that I put together here of all the things you want to consider for a podcast. So the first part here is what I call the pre-game. And this is what you're going to get ready to do before you even launch your podcast. All the things you have to start to think about. So I always like to start with why. And I know it's a cliche because we've heard it a million times from Simon Sinek, talking about everything to do with why and how important that is. But in podcasting, it's very important because there's a statistic out there, and it could change and it could vary. But right now, my understanding is 70% of podcasters quit after the 7th episode, and 90% will quit after the 20th. So bottom line is, whether that percentage changes, there's a huge amount of people that get so excited to start a podcast, but they quit and get discouraged. And the reason I believe that happens is because they don't have a good why. A lot of people, when they get started and I ask them why, their answer is typically the same. I'm going to get a lot of listeners so that I can build my business, and I'm going to make a lot of money. And when those things don't happen the way they project, they get discouraged because there's a disconnect between their why and what's motivating them to start the podcast. So I will say that podcasting really provides so much more than that. So for me, for example, the relationships that I get to build, the people that I learn from, the ability to give my my guests on the show a resource, and my listeners with information. All of those things are the things that drive me to continue to do it every week and spend hours of my time doing it. So it's not a chore for me. It's almost a therapy. If I have to say, it's actually enhanced my life in more ways than I can imagine. And so from that perspective alone, it's worth everything to me. The rest is a bonus. The fact that people are listening, Joyce was talking about some of the limiting beliefs that I had, and I had a lot. I don't like my voice. I have an accent. There were so many things that I was saying to myself, giving myself reasons and excuses why I shouldn't do it. But I think I was more compelled when I asked myself what would happen if I didn't. That scared me more. And I decided I just had to go out and try it. And it just, again, it's just been the best thing ever. So you need to be connected with your why. So I'll start there. The next thing is, of course, you need to know who your target audience is. I mean, most podcasters will tell you that it's very important to niche down to really identify who you want to talk to. So Reno, for example, here, he niches into Chicago and everything about Chicago. And that's wonderful because the audience is very connected. Everything he's talking about is very specific, and that is definitely recommended. Now, that doesn't mean you have to do it. You can go against the grain. Again, go back to your why. For me, I wanted to talk to a variety of people because it's more important for me to have very interesting guests and bring lots of different information to my show. And as a result, I knew there'd be a trade-off, and that was a decision that I felt I needed to make for myself. So as long as you're connected with that and you understand why you're making these decisions, everything's going to be fine. The next thing is, what value are you going to provide? So we're going back to the original 10 reasons, right? Are you going to entertain people? Are you going to educate people? Are you going to inspire them? What is your reason? And be sure that that's what you're always leaning towards when you're providing, when you're putting out your podcast. So bottom line is those three elements are very critical. So we'll go, and I'm going to just keep going because we have a limited amount of time and lots to cover. So I'm just going to keep going, and then if you have any questions, let me know. And Joyce, could you monitor that for me? Because I'm focused on this. If there's anything, just stop me and I'll answer it. Okay.
Yeah, I'll watch the chat.
Okay, perfect. So the next thing is you want to think about the length, the frequency, and the format of your podcast. So what I mean by that is, how long are you going to record for when you put out your episode? How often are you going to put out your episode? And what type of format are you going to provide? So the length, on average, most podcasts that I see out there are around an hour. That's very, very common. But somewhere around 22 to 30 minutes is a really good sweet spot. And the reason being is because people like, and again, it just depends on the type of podcast you're doing, but the 22 to 30 minute range is great because people can drive to a specific location and typically listen to your show, or maybe they'll work out for 30 minutes. And so it's a really good place to start if you're wondering, where you should fall. As far as frequency, the most popular that I hear at the moment is once a week, but there's people who do it daily, believe it or not. They do very short podcasts every day. There's people who, put out more than one a week, and there's some that do once a month. So the bottom line is you need to decide that for yourself and stick with it. The most important thing is be very, very consistent with whatever you do, because what happens is you get listeners who follow along, and they'll get very confused if you just put podcasts out whenever you feel like it. So try and stay with that consistency. And then as far as format,
just for a minute. First off, Reno says he keeps his under 30 minutes. And then Ernie asked if we could get a copy of your PowerPoint. And see, what I was thinking, when people registered through the Zoom, we got their email. So Marisa, what I'll do is provide you a list of all those people and their emails. And then if you don't mind, you might want to send that out directly. So then they've got your contact information. Should we plan to do that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so the answer is yes, Ernie. Okay,
perfect.
Thank you for letting me in.
Yeah, sure. So now in terms of the podcast format, there's lots of different ways you can approach it, but I'll talk about the three main formats. So you either have the solo. Some people just don't want guests. They just don't want to worry about all the responsibility that comes with inviting guests to your show. So that's the solo format. Then you can obviously do the guest, which is the way I do my show. So I have guests on my show. And then some people do a mix. So they may have solo one week and then have a guest the next week. And then some people literally have panels. So think of it like a big studio, and you might have 5 people in there, and you could rent a space and, invite people in there and maybe do that monthly. So again, you just need to decide which format is going to be a right fit for you. I would say that if you were going to do solo, you're going to have a little bit of a harder time getting people to find your show because you have no one to promote it with. I mean, you're the only person promoting your show because you are the star of the show. Whereas if you have guests, your guests are obviously going to share it with their community. So it's going to help give you a little more leverage. So that's something to consider there. But again, always go back to your why. Why are you doing this? For me, I could never imagine doing a show without guests. I love the conversations, what I learned from them, and I like helping promote them as well. So again, if you're very clear on what it is that you want to do, the answers to these questions will be clear as well. Okay. So then the third section here is kind of the prep for naming your podcast, getting your cover art, and using music for your intros and outros. So for those of you not familiar with podcasting, if you've listened to any shows, you will notice that there's usually an introduction, there's usually some ending, and there's music involved somewhere there. And so what I would say about that is just make sure that whatever music that you're using and however you end up designing this, that it's a royalty free, that you are allowed to use it. It needs to be commercial use. Do not take any songs from the radio or anything like that and put it out there because, that's not going to be a good thing. And so there are different platforms out there that you can use to get royalty-free music. And I will just give you 2 very basic ones. Audio Jungle is one of them, and the other one is called Story Blocks or Audio Blocks. They kind of the same company, and you can just purchase whatever. Some of them are subscription based. Some of them you could just buy one song, and then you can create your intro outros. By the way, for this, you could also hire somebody. So you could find somebody on Fiverr who specializes in making these sorts of things, and they can create kind of a radio thing. For me, I am just a very kind of authentic, straightforward person. I don't like a lot of flair, so I do my own. And so it's still me doing the intro, outro. Other people, they go all out with, really elaborate ones. And so again, that's a decision you're going to have to make. As far as naming your podcast, I mean, the advice is name it something that's very obvious. I went against the grain, as you can see, but a lot of people will use names that are very obvious about what they're talking about. And that's probably the best thing to do because people will be able to see the name and go, oh, they're talking about cats. I like cats, so I'm going to go here and listen to cats. And so that's really what you want to think about if you want to try and attract a specific type of audience, again, going back to the niche that you're going to go after. And then as far as your cover art is concerned, I guess my advice here is that just keep in mind that this is not something that's easy to change around, because as I go through all this, you will realize that you have to get permission from a lot of these platforms to host your podcast. And once you submit your art, it's not like you can just go in and start changing it left and right every time you want. You can do that on YouTube. You can do that on lots of social media platforms, but it doesn't work that way with podcasting. So I would say is as much as you can be very happy with whatever it is that you design, stick with, create something, put the effort up front and put it out there and just stick with it, because it also confuses your audience when you start changing art. As well. Not only is it not easy to do, but then, your audience will not be able to find you. They get familiar with the colors and the pictures and the words, and you want that. So I highly recommend you either hire a graphic designer or, create something that you're really going to be proud of up front. Okay, so now this is the big part here. People are just always, the first thing they want to know is what type of equipment should I get? And how do I pick my recording and editing software? So podcasting has exploded. There's a lot of different options now, but I would always recommend, because we'll go back to the statistics I shared with you. You know, a lot of people get into this and don't realize how much work goes into it, and they quit. And so before you spend thousands of dollars on all this fancy stuff that everybody tries to sell you online, I recommend just getting what you need to make you sound good and get you comfortable with the process using just your computer and a microphone and a very basic editing software. And then once you get into the groove and you realize that this is something you want to do, you can definitely upgrade and still use your mic. Or even if you had to upgrade your mic, it's not going to be that big a deal because you could always use a second microphone. So I would say start with the basics. And in that case, I think that, you know, the basics that I'm referring to is like a laptop. I use a Mac. Get a microphone with a USB that you would just connect directly to your computer, and then use a basic software that's not going to cost you anything. So my recommendation for a microphone would be probably the Samsung Q2U, and you can get that on Amazon. And, you know, don't quote the price, but it's somewhere around $60-$70 for that. So it's not expensive at all, and it's going to make you sound very decent. It'll be clean, it'll be nice, and you're going to feel confident with your first episodes, putting it out there, and then, you know, you can take it from there. But that should be a good enough microphone for you to feel proud of how your episode sounds. And then in terms of software, I personally like Audacity. I started with GarageBand actually, and I ended up switching to Audacity, and I personally just love it. It's so easy. It has everything that I need. It's free. It works with Mac and PC. So frankly, to start, I wouldn't use anything else. There are so many different great platforms that have all the bells and whistles. And if you want to be a sound engineer, go for it. But I'm talking about a basic podcast right now. You know, we're starting with the beginning. I highly recommend you just stick with that. So that's what I'll say about equipment. And so moving on to the podcast hosting. So people ask me this question a lot. You know, unlike YouTube, when you start a channel, you can just turn on your channel, start recording, put it out there. And then as you build an audience, you can go ahead and start to monetize when you get to that point, when you get enough people watching your videos. Well, it doesn't work that way with podcasting. Podcasting requires you to get permission from various hosts. And in order to do that, you need a hosting company that puts your the term they use is an RSS feed, but it's essentially a sort of directory that is created for your podcast that gets sent out to all these different platforms so that they give you permission to put it out into the world. Now, all you need is a one-time permission. So before you launch your podcast, you're going to get authorization from Apple, from Google Play, from Stitcher, from Deezer, from iHeartRadio, all of these different platforms, Spotify. And once you get that approval, then every time you go to your host and release your episode, it automatically shoots out to all these. But the very, very first time you do it, you have to get approval. So that's a process, and that's part of your pregame. That's why you have to plan ahead, because you want to get that all approved so that by the time you launch, all you have to do is put it out there. And so that being said, you're going to have a host that manages all of these podcasts that you put out there. And the one I love to use, and I just love everything about them, I can't think of anything I don't like, is Buzzsprout. So that's the hosting company that I use. Now, that's paid, but it's very, very affordable, and they give you a lot of different features, and everything that I need is in there and so easy to use. That being said, if you really want to start out just with a free option, then you can look at something like Anchor. Now with Anchor, it's free, but you know, that word I use very loosely because it's very much like Facebook is free, but there is a price that you pay for these services in a different way, right? So just think of that. You're going to get great customer service and support and training through Buzzsprout that you likely won't get with Anchor. You're not going to get a live person to answer questions or do things like that. So understand the pros and cons. Lots of people are using Anchor. Lots of people are using Buzzsprout, and there are many others out there. So you can do your research and find the one you like. I got lucky. I decided with Buzzsprout from the very beginning, and I can't even imagine leaving. I'm super happy with the service they provide. Okay, and then lastly on this section here, just think about, you know, if you want to have a website or landing page for your audience, that's kind of something you should consider. When I started, I didn't know about a lot of options. So I built my own WordPress page, a very simple page that has everything that I need. But these days, people are using this thing called Pod Page. It's very, very popular. It's kind of like a Wix or a Squarespace for podcasters. So it's got everything you need to start your podcast. Again, very low monthly fee. And I hear a lot of great things about it. I don't use it myself, but the buzz out there is that it's really good. So I would check that out. And then for me, because I have guests on my show, I also prepared a podcast guidelines list so that when my guests come on the show, they're very clear on how it's going to work, what I need from them. I might ask for a photo, an intro, all of those details will be in those guidelines so that they're very comfortable with how things work. Remember, your guests are scared. Oftentimes, they've never been on a show before, and they need to put a lot of trust in you. And so I want my guests to feel super comfortable and not have any concerns about the process. And then the last thing personally I do is I have a guest release form that they basically sign that says it's okay for me to record, it's okay for me to edit and put it out into the world. And that's just me. A lot of podcasters don't bother with that, but I do. So that's the pregame. That's what you need to do to get yourself ready to start your show. Any questions so far before I move on to the actual, kind of daily procedure? Do we have anything, Joyce?
There's nothing that's come up in the chat.
Okay,
Reno's been
perfect.
dropping a couple of his own experiences in there. A couple other people are making suggestions, but they're more like FYI, this is stuff that I'm doing.
Perfect.
I have one question. She said buzz, and I didn't understand the last buzz.
Yeah, Buzzsprout.
Buzzsprout.
Yeah, Buzzsprout.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And
Okay,
I'd
so
like,
I'll just keep moving.
and I would just say one more thing real quick,
Yeah.
having been a guest on a show, I've been on numerous others, as I said, no one else even comes close to Marisa in the specificity of the guidelines and the prep. A super detailed oriented person, really, especially for someone new to being a guest. I think it's important, but I think it's valuable for anyone. So want to say hats off to you for that practice and that
Thank you,
protocol,
Joyce.
Marisa.
Thank you,
Mhm.
Joyce. I just do it because I kind of treat people the way I want to be treated. And I feel like people don't know me enough to know that they can trust me, and I want them to feel comfortable. So I'm glad that came through for you, Joyce.
Mhm.
All right, so now we're going to the actual, people always ask me, well, what's your routine look like on a weekly basis? You put out a show every week, and how does that work for you? So the first thing, obviously, when I get ready to do a recording is I script the show, but it's not what you think. It's not scripting like I know what we're going to be saying. Everything we talk about is totally, random. There's nothing written down. What I mean by that is just general guidelines. If we're going to be talking about dogs, what are we going to be talking about? There's a million things we can talk about if we're talking about dogs. So I want to have kind of a specific format of some of the key points that we're going to be covering on the show. So I guess that's it. It's basically key points, bullet points, however you want to call it, just to give me an idea of the conversation and how it's going to flow. But I have my own elements that I like to bring into each episode. And so that just gives us a little bit of direction. So we're not floundering and talking for hours, because again, my goal is to capture somewhere around 25 to 30 minutes of content. By the time I edit and clean it up a little bit, it'll drop down to the range that I'm looking for. So that's what I mean by scripting. And I think it helps the guests as well, so that they don't feel like blindsided with questions or weird things that they're not sure about. It again helps them feel comfortable with what you're going to be talking about during that interview. Then the next thing is editing. This is the biggest chunk. Now, there's a lot of controversy in the podcast world. There are, I like to call podcast purists, who feel like, whatever I record is going to go on the air. I don't care if I'm flushing a toilet or the dog's barking or UPS delivery man comes, right? And they feel like that is the way it needs to be. And there's people like me who like to edit, because from my perspective, I respect my guests and my listeners. And I don't want my listeners to have to listen to things that are going to take up extra time that is not needed in the show. So I like to clean it up. I like to polish it up. The other thing is I also respect my guests in the sense that, they are business people and they are using this as a way to reach out to other people and have other people get a sense of who they are, and they want to be proud of their show. And so I want to give them a final product that they're going to be proud to share. So again, always go back to your why when you make any sort of decision when it comes to podcasting. There's no right or wrong. The purists are fine. If they're happy doing it, good for them. I'm doing it for my own reasons. And so if you decide that you are going to edit your podcast, just understand that it does take time. And so it will take more time. And as a result, you also want to tie that back to how long your podcast will be. Because if you're doing an hour podcast and you plan to edit, you're going to be spending way more time editing an hour than you are 30 minutes. So weigh both those areas so that you can decide what you're comfortable doing. Of course, after a while, in the beginning, when you're editing, you feel like the world's coming to an end because you don't know what you're doing. But then now you can close your eyes after all the editing that I've done. My hands just go where they need to go. I don't even have to think about it. So it becomes second nature once you get used to it. The next thing is show notes. This is where it's similar to your YouTube. You know how you have that little section where they add links and tell you, put ads, or maybe tell you how, anything about the guest or how to get a hold of them or anything like that. That we have the same version. So you're going to have to type all that in and enter all that information. Maybe your guest has a promotional offer that they want to include. You're going to put it all in there. So that's what your show notes are. Transcription. You can hire somebody to transcribe. You can transcribe yourself. There's lots of tools out there. Plenty. The most popular one that people like a lot is called Descript, and it does a lot. It's more than just the transcription. It can actually serve also as your editing software. Because I use Audacity, I don't need it. So I transcribe with a tool called Otter AI, and it works fine. I mean, I still need to go in there and make edits and changes, but it allows me to listen to the podcast one more time to see if I missed anything anyway. So it's just a scrub for me, and it's no big deal. And I do it. My niece is deaf, and she wanted to listen to the show, and so that got me into transcribing. But the other piece of it is not only are you able to reach people who can't hear or may be hearing impaired, but it's also great for SEO. So if you plan to repurpose and you want to have SEO for your podcast, transcribing is a must. So I highly recommend you consider that. And then chapter markers, I guess the best way to describe that is it's like the table of contents for your book. You wouldn't read a book without looking at the table of contents to see what's in it. So it's the same with a podcast. You kind of want to maybe jump to the 5-minute mark where they talk about X, Y, Z. So it really helps the listener if they want to get to a specific section of your podcast. And then lastly, sound bites. Oh my goodness, I have nothing else to say about this except that it's a necessity. Because think about it. If I told you to go watch a movie, the first thing you would want to do is look for the trailer. You want to know what the movie's about. Does it look like it has a lot of good scenes? And is it interesting enough for you? People aren't just going to go to your podcast because they want to listen to you. They want to know if it's going to be worth their while. So when you give them a sound bite and they get a sense of what that podcast is about, then you can drive them to actually listen to your podcast. So you want to be very, very selective and find a really intriguing part of the show recording that you can insert there. And it's usually somewhere between 50 and 60 seconds, so to speak. And then you just put that out there, and that's a great promotional way that you can use on social media. Like I put that on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, everywhere, so people know what my episode is about for that week. So super powerful. And that's also built into Buzzsprout, by the way. So you don't have to go anywhere else. You can just get it there. If you're not using Buzzsprout, there's another tool called headliner.io, I believe. And that's a really great way to create sound bites as well. I love that. It works really well. Okay, so we're wrapping it up here and we're going to the post game. Okay, so now you set up your podcast, you're out there, you're podcasting, you know what your day is like and your week is like or whatnot. How do you get it out into the world? How do you let people know that you exist? Well, obvious, and Joyce will know this, social media is powerful, and I don't know how we did anything without it, to be honest, because it's a great way to just get your information out there. That being said, you don't want to bombard people with, posting the same thing every day, because then that's, they're going to be disinterested if you just keep saying, listen to my podcast, listen to my podcast. So for me, I just blast them out with little sound bites and something about what the guest is saying that might be intriguing. And I put that out like once a week. And then the rest of the week, I switch it up with other interesting things like Monday Monday mindset, or other messages that tie to the content of the episode without actually saying, listen to my show, because you'll be bothering people, and they're not going to like it. And then as far as communities and groups, it's huge. You need to create a community. So you need to decide, do I want a public community, a private community? How do I get people involved so that they can reach you and ask questions and get intrigued by what you're doing? So I highly recommend doing that. And again, all the platforms have something or other related to that, and it ties to your audience. Like, I have a lot of business people listening to my show, so LinkedIn is big for me, but Facebook is also very powerful. Collaboration. So you can collaborate with people like I do by having guests on the show, because I promote their businesses or their books, or they are mostly coaches, writers, business people. So they get something out of it, and we're able to collaborate by me giving them something that they can use for marketing, and they giving me their knowledge that I can share with my listeners. So always always think about how to collaborate with other people. I talked about repurposing. Again, going back to the transcripts, that's wonderful, because you could share that maybe with somebody who puts out a newsletter to your audience, and then they could promote your podcasts and share the information, and then they're happy because you're giving them content. So always look at ways that you can share and repurpose. And then the question somebody asked about being a podcast guest. And Joyce, you are a testament to how powerful that is. And I think that you would know a lot about it, but I can basically share some very key things that you want to think about. You can join online groups. So for example, Facebook has a lot of groups where they connect guests with podcast hosts, and podcast hosts need content. Guests want to be on the show. It's a win-win. So you can join those groups. Just look them up, and there'll be a list that will pop up for you, and then just join them and see what people are asking for. And if there's a fit, then you can join them, and that's a great way to go. The other is there's a lot of platforms out there that matchmake. So there's one called matchmaker.fm, and you can go in there, set up a free account. The hosts are in there, and then you can just message them and then meet them and see if it's a good connection and be part of their show. So there's a lot of different things you can do. I will say that podcast guests, you want to always approach it from the perspective of, how can I be of value to the host? So don't approach it as, hey, I want to be on your show because I want to sell my product, right? Nobody's going to be interested in bringing you on. You want to talk about how you're going to help spread the word about their podcast, how you're going to help them in some way, how you're going to help the audience that they're trying to reach. How are you going to be of value is how you want to talk to them, and instead of coming at it from, you're lucky to have me because I'm going to be a guest on your show kind of thing. And if you want that information, by the way, and Joyce sends me the email, I have a little sheet that I prepared that talks about some of the things you want to consider if you want to be a podcast guest. And I think that might be helpful for you to be able to reach out to other people. The other thing is, if you have a media kit, that would be huge, because you could already tell them, here are the topics that I want to talk about. This is what I've done so far. This is the book I've written. These are testimonials that I have. It makes it so easy for us, because once we have that, we have pretty much all the information we need to get you on the show. So make it easy for your guests and make them want to have you. And then lastly, I would say monetization. That's always the number one question people ask. It's a lot harder to do on a podcast. What I will say is that you might want to start with selling your services. So if you're an expert in a particular field, always revert your listeners back to a workshop that you're doing, or a book that you're putting out, or something along the lines of what you are offering at the end, because you're building trust, you're sharing information that they value, and as they get to know you, like you, trust you, then they're going to want to buy from you. That would be the easiest approach to take, and that is very effective for a lot of podcasters, especially if you're very clear on what you're covering. That being said, you can definitely get sponsors, but it takes a lot of listens to get to that point, and you have to really show that you have a very niche audience and that you're getting a lot of people for that to be worthwhile. You can also do affiliates, but the problem with affiliates I find is that they're not usually in front of a computer listening to your podcast. They're doing other things. So the likelihood of them, after they get home walking their dog in the, in the park, logging into a computer and clicking on your particular link to buy whatever that product is very difficult. So I would say that's not, likely going to happen, but it can happen. So, and there's many other ways you could approach it. You could get a Patreon community started and give them, special things that, for being a member that you will do that you don't do for other people. There's just a lot of things you can do, but I would say those are the top things that you want to start thinking about. And then I'll end it in the very end by saying that, as you can see, there's a lot of work, a lot of work and love goes into every episode that gets put out there. It's not, it's not like you just hit a record button, unless you're, like I said, a purist. And if you do that, just put it up there, then yeah, you could really, really cut it to basically nothing. But I put a lot of work into every episode I put out. That being said, you have 3 approaches here. You can do full in-house production, which is what I do. Nobody touches my podcast but me. I put, my heart and soul into every episode from start to finish. Then you get the partial, which is, let's say you don't like transcribing and you absolutely hate that part, or maybe editing is something you absolutely don't enjoy. You can hire companies to do just that piece. And then lastly, if you don't like any part of it and you just want to get on, record something and put it out into the world, there are options to do full production. You can hire companies that do it all for you. You just hand them the file, they take care of the rest. Now, that being said, if you have more time or more money, you will know which direction to take, right? And that's pretty much it. So I hope I covered the basics. Does anybody have any questions that I did not address?
Yeah, before we get to questions, we had a couple of latecomers, so I was wondering if it's not too much trouble if people could put their information into the chat one more time. And some people are having to drop off, so I understand that. So why don't please do that? If put your own information if you haven't already, and then go to but yes, I would like to know more about well, I guess what I want to do is just chime in about the guesting. So when I decided on Marisa's advice to really go for it with podcasts, I actually put up posts in Facebook and especially on LinkedIn that I was looking for podcasting opportunities. So that was a way that did it. And then if you are hit on a podcast, as you can imagine, that podcaster will possibly could refer you to other podcast hosts. That's also happened for me, and really want to nurture that relationship. One of my podcast hosts became my client, and I've had at least 7 sessions with her on LinkedIn. Mm-hmm. That is like the ultimate, right? Because I don't think I've had any other client, if maybe one, that's even come close to that. So just thought I'd mention that.
And the thing that, and I would say the positive piece about being a guest is you don't have to worry about any of this. You can reach the target audience that you're going after, and the host is doing all the work for you. Now, the downside, obviously, is you don't have control. You don't have control of a lot of things, like whether or not the host will even want to interview you. So there's work involved on the back end. So it's, again, we're going back to your why. What are you going for? If you decide to be a guest on a podcast, I would say set goals. Joyce did that. She decided, okay, I want to do 4 podcasts a month or whatever. And then she went after it, because if you set goals, then you're likely going to go after the number that you're looking for.
I think I'm going to